Hello and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscape Program's homeowner webinar series. My name is Jen Marvin. I'm the Florida Artisan Neighborhoods statewide coordinator. Today we have Jamie Daugherty speaking about pruning for the homeowner. Your microphones have been muted. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation, although we might stop a little bit, in the middle after a few sections to take questions as well. Please stick around until the end of the presentation to take the survey. It helps me give you the kind of programming that you like and lets us know what how we're doing. Our next presentation will be the third Tuesday in May. We're skipping April due to some complications, and that will be at 11. So May 17th at 11 a.m., where we will talk about youth gardening. So let me tell you a little bit about Jamie. Jamie Daugherty is IFAS Residential Horticultural Agent in Lake County. She holds degrees in environmental biology, ecology, and forestry science, and has been an ISA Certified Arborist since 2010. In 2021, she obtained an additional qualification in tree risk management. She came to Extension in 2020 with over 13 years combined experience in urban forestry and higher education. As the residential horticulture agent, her goal is to educate homeowners in proper pruning practices to ensure the health and safety of their trees. And without further ado, I will turn the stage over to Jamie.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks everybody for coming out today. I'm very excited to present to you about tree pruning for homeowners. As Jen said, I love trees, and one of the most important things I think is tree education, so that you all know how to best care for this long-lived resource so that you also get the most benefits out of the resource. Let's see if we can get this moving. There we go. So today we're going to learn a few different things. I'm going to start off with basic plant physiology. Then I'm going to get into pruning trees and palms, because palms are different than trees. And at the end, we'll wrap up with pruning shrubs. Now I will have different stopping points where I'll ask if there are any clarification questions before I move forward. And we'll take a couple at that point, and then at the end, I can answer additional questions as well. So we're going to start off with basic plant physiology, but don't worry, there's not a test. So this is just so we all have the same basic level of understanding. So we'll start with the parts of a tree. There are a few major parts of a tree. The top that has all of the branches and all of the leaves is often called the crown. It can also be referred to as the canopy. So those are interchangeable words that you may hear me use today. Something that everybody's familiar with is the trunk. The trunk is a very important part of the tree. It holds that tree up so the leaves can get to the sunlight. But then there's another part that's highly important that a lot of people don't know about, and that is the root flare. So the root flare is this transitional zone where the trunk tissue moves into the root tissue. So to know, for example, that your tree was planted correctly, you would be able to see on most trees that the trunk goes down, flares out a little bit, and you can see those topmost roots. That means your tree was planted correctly. If, however, your tree looks a bit more like a telephone pole, it's likely planted too deep. And you can ask your local extension agent for help on planting a new tree. If a tree is pretty old, it's not too much you can do about incorrect planting at that point. The other important part is the roots. There are lots of different roots. Now, one thing on this diagram you can note is that most of those roots are within that top 3 feet of soil. So that is where most of active root growth for the majority of plants actually is, in that top 3 feet. So if you ever see those diagrams that look like, a tree's on top and it mirrors the tree on the bottom and the roots, that's not accurate. The roots actually go out much farther than they go deep. So next we're going to talk about the internal structure of a trunk. And that's because that's vital to help you understand why we need to prune the way that we do. So this diagram is showing a cross section of a trunk that in the industry we refer to as a tree cookie. I'm not sure why we call them that, but I think it's kind of fun. I always call them tree cookies. So if you look at the inside of a trunk, some trees have what's called heartwood. It usually happens as trees get older, and it's when you cut into the tree and it's darker in the center. So heartwood has been filled with resins because those cells are no longer actively transporting anything. And that resin helps to ensure that fungus and diseases and pathogens don't come up through the roots. So that's there to help to protect that tree. It also kind of acts like extra support. So if you think about like rebar in the middle of a concrete pole, it's kind of like that to help hold it together. Outside of that, heartwood is going to be the active xylem. So the xylem is, for the most part, bringing up inorganic nutrients and water from the soil. So fertilizer that you put down, other nutrients in the soil, they are coming up through the xylem attached to water molecules. Now, the next layer is the growing layer of the trunk, and it's very thin and very close to the bark tissue. And this is why it's important to understand this, because when we prune, if we damage this layer, it's not going to repair itself in that location. So the cambium layer is the layer of cells that divide. So it's basically one cell layer thick, so very small. And as cells divide, on the inside, it makes xylem tissue, and on the outside, it makes phloem tissue. Now, the phloem tissue is what takes the product of photosynthesis, so all the sugars that are made, it's called photosynthate, but you can think of it as sugar. It will move it down to where it needs to be in the plant, and then excess is moved down to the roots for storage. So when we're talking about pruning and we're talking about trunk tears or bark tears, it's the phloem and the cambium that we're really concerned about damaging. The xylem usually has several layers, and it takes a significant amount of damage to irreparably harm existing xylem tissue. So another term that might come up is the drip line, and the drip line's pretty easy. If it rains and then after rain you stand under a tree and you get wet, you're in the drip line. So the drip line is outside of that canopy or the crown all the way to the ground, and it includes the roots under it. Now, those roots are also within what's referred to as the critical root zone. So if you're doing construction or you're thinking about planting a tree and you can tell that there's not room for roots, you want to think about, either not planting a tree there or really doing some protection around those roots to keep them safe while you're doing construction. So critical root zone is generally underneath the canopy of the tree. So we're going to keep going with terms to know. So this is an interesting image because this is a branch attached to a trunk. That's obviously just a part of it, but all of the bark stripped away so you can see kind of how those cells work. Excuse me. So this is my hand. I'm holding this. So in my hand, I'm holding what would be the trunk. So in the trunk, you can see what's called the branch bark collar. So the branch bark collar is where you have trunk tissue that actually wraps around the tissue that makes up the branch. And you can see that here. Let's see if I can get this to draw for us. So we can see right here, right? This is going around, right? It's going around right there. And then we have the branch tissue where we can see these cells and this tissue is going straight out. Right? And that's important to understand for why we have to prune the way we prune to get the fastest healing and the best result for your particular plant. So the branch bark collar is something that we'll refer to quite a lot today. I'll also mention the branch bark ridge, and I will mention that when it's visible because you don't always have that in a tree, but we have some pictures later that I will point it out. And it's pretty easy to distinguish once you've seen it. So here we have branch that basically goes into the trunk tissue. So these lines that I have drawn kind of represent that vascular tissue, which we talked about, and that vascular tissue is going to be the xylem and the phloem and the cambium tissue. So it's not connected at that branch bark collar. So they are separate. It's kind of like if you took a trunk, you have a trunk with a hole in it, and then the branch is just kind of stuck in. And let me show you on the next slide. This is what that looks like. So let me grab my pen again. So here we can see this is that tissue. Oh, well, hang on. Here we go. It really just wants to put that down before I can draw anything. All right, here we go. This tissue is going in, right? This tissue is going down, and we can see here is about the point that everything comes together. So I can see that this is branch tissue coming in right there. And then everything up here, right here, that's trunk tissue that's coming around. And that's where that branch bark collar actually is. So if we were doing a pruning cut here, you'd be pruning approximately where that line is because you don't want to prune into the branch bark collar because you want that tissue to be intact so that when you do the cut, those cells can then start healing over that wound to help protect the tree from infection from pests, diseases, or other pathogens. So another term that will come up is included bark. So included bark is a weak branch attachment. It allows for moisture to accumulate, fungus to accumulate. It's more likely to break, and I have fun images of that later on. But what this is like is basically if you have skin rubbing against skin for long periods, what happens? It gets irritated, right? It's not particularly strong. So if you take your hand and you put it on your shoulder, you can pull that apart because just because your skin's touching doesn't mean all of a sudden, your arms fuse together. It's the same thing with included bark. The bark does not fuse together in this location. It's bark on bark. It's not structurally sound. It's not very strong. And the arrow is pointing that out, and it does go down quite a ways. So I'll grab my pen again. We can see it's going down quite far. And in a wind, or if you were to, for example, hang a chair off of one of these branches, it would put a lot of stress on that joint and have an increased chance of the tree just kind of collapsing away from itself. Another term that's going to come up as we talk about pruning is a node. And a node is an area where you have growth coming off of a branch. So this can involve additional stems, branches, leaves, flowers, fruits. So in the one that I'm holding, this is a little stem. It has no bark on it, which again is great because we can see how, right, the trunk tissue is going around that branch tissue. Okay, and we can see over here as well, this is branch tissue coming out right there. And we can actually see that branch bark collar as well, which would be then right there, if you can see that line. So those are also nodes because it's an area of growth. Now nodes look a little bit different. It's easier to spot nodes on younger growth on any plant versus older growth because it's a lot harder, especially when you have a woody plant that gets a trunk and has bark. It's a lot harder to find nodes on those. Not impossible, but harder to the point when I talk about pruning to a node. If the tree is a certain size, it's better to call a professional because it's pretty hard for a professional to find too. All right, and the last one we're going to talk about for terminology today is going to be arborescent. And arborescent means tree-like in appearance, but they are not trees. So when we talk about palms, we're talking about an arborescent plant. Bananas are arborescent. Tree ferns are arborescent. So they get large like a tree, but they don't have that same cellular structure that produces wood. So for a tree to truly be a tree, it makes woody tissue. Palms don't make woody tissue. Their vascular system's completely different. Doesn't mean that they're any better or worse. They're just different, and pruning of them and care of them is vastly different than of a tree. All right, so I'm going to get into pruning, but before I jump in, I just wanted to see if there was any questions on clarification of terms before I move forward.
Doesn't look like it.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward, and we're going to talk about specifically pruning. So we're going to talk about why we prune, what to look for, and how to prune next. All right. So why are we going to prune? So the key is doing selective pruning, not just pruning all willy-nilly without a plan. You want to be selective in how you're pruning your plants. So number one reason to prune is to keep the plant healthy. You want to make sure that you're removing dead, diseased, and injured branches. You want to keep the plant strong. So you're going to remove or reduce stems that compete with the main leader. So the main leader is a central trunk of a tree. The larger the tree is, the more likely it's designed to have a central leader. Smaller canopy trees, something like a dogwood or a crepe myrtle, often do have multiple stems or multiple leaders, and that's okay for them. It's really important to know the structure of your tree that's healthy so that you prune for that particular structure. You want to keep the plant uniform, so remove branches that cross each other because they're going to cause injuries on each other, and branches that just generally look out of place. It happens sometimes. You get like a gangly branch off to the side, and sometimes those need to go. And you want to keep your pruning minor. Any major pruning, you really want to call a professional for. So what constitutes major pruning? Well, things like if your tree's over 15 feet tall, if your tree needs significantly large branches pruned off, or if you think that you need to prune more than about a third of the canopy, you definitely want to get a professional. In the industry, we say you don't want to prune more than a third of a canopy of a tree at a time to ensure that the tree is able to heal and be healthy. So if you had, for example, a large branch that needed removed and it would result in 50% of the tree coming off, it would not be advised to take it all off at once. So hire a professional and they can do a schedule to take this off over the course of a few years so that your tree can then get a better form. And correct pruning really reduces the chance of failures during storms. And throughout the presentation, when I say storm, I don't just mean a hurricane, I mean Florida storms, because hurricanes are extra special events, basically. Nobody can plan for a hurricane. We can only make our trees safe for our average storm. And generally speaking, when we do that, it also increases the chances that they will make it through a hurricane as well. All right, so as a quick reminder, what are we looking for when we're looking to prune? You're looking for loose and dead branches. You're looking at those branch attachments and for included bark. So branch attachments on a tree, U shapes, generally good. V shapes, generally bad. V shapes generally lead to included bark over time, whereas U shapes have a nice branch attachment and they're a lot stronger than those V attachments. Look for things like trunk lean. Trunk lean is not an automatic death sentence for plants. It's something that you may need a professional to look at depending on the circumstances, and we'll talk about that more later. Look for trunk damage. There's certain kinds of trunk damage that will mean take the tree out right away, others that won't. Something else to consider is the species, because different species have different items to consider. For example, as elm trees grow, they are known to drop limbs with no warning. Perfectly healthy limbs drop all the time. I used to work in New York City for the Parks Department. There were a bunch of elms in Central Park, and they would be kind of blocked off from the public to discourage people from hanging out under them because they were reaching an age where they would drop limbs without warning. Locust plants, they drop limbs without warning. Maples tend to be a little bit weaker in windstorms. Laurel oaks have a life expectancy of about 70 years, and as early as 40 years, laurels can start to rot out on the inside, and that's something to keep in mind if you have laurel oaks. Live oaks live for several hundred years, so you generally don't expect a lot of problems with them when they're younger. It can happen, but it's less frequent with those. All right, so let's look for loose and dead branches. So unfortunately, you guys can't point them out to me, so I'm going to point them out for you. So in this picture, we have several dead branches that may be loose. So in Florida, we're pretty wet, right? It's a wet environment. We're overall really humid. We have lots of moisture, and all of that increases the rate of decomposition. So if you're a snowbird and you're from, up north, decomposition happens slower up there because it tends to be drier, it tends to be colder. That slows down the decomposition process. So if you have dead branches in your tree, they're going to decompose faster, and they're much more likely to fall out in a general windstorm or just fall out and, because they are dead. The larger the limb, the more important it is for you to take it out. These are relatively small limbs. This particular tree is not over anywhere where there is significant risk if these fall out. So I wouldn't be in a huge rush to take these out specifically, but if this tree was over a playground, I'd be telling people, you should really take those out just to avoid the risk and to prevent disease from possibly getting into the plant more. So I mentioned branch attachment and included bark and central leaders. So I want to talk about that in this particular image. So this is a, all I can think of is a Latin name. So it's a Plantanoides. Wow, if anybody remembers what this is called, I can only think of the Latin name right now. And sycamore, there we go. I finally got it. Sorry about that. So this is a sycamore, and generally sycamores are designed for a single leader. So when this tree was younger, it would have been good to pick one of these. This tree is has codominant stems. So there are two stems here. Right now, it's fine. Right now, it has a more of a U shape than a V shape. But as this grows, that will turn into a V shape right there. So over time, these limbs will come together, have an included bark issue. And it's not going to happen in the lifetime of the person that currently owns that house. So it's up to them on whether or not they want to deal with it. If you have something like this on your property, Right now, it's not any risk, but it's something to think about. If you have a younger tree that looks like this, you definitely want to pick one of those and have the other one taken off. So with included bark, you don't always know that it has included bark. I think we can all agree, looking at this live oak, it looks pretty nice. There's nothing really wrong with it. It's got relatively good structure. Yeah, looks pretty good. But if you go driving past it, there's included bark almost all the way down. And that top one, you can actually see through the trunk to the other side. So the tree is already pulling apart. If you have a tree like this on your property, that's a very large, nice tree that you like, there are things you can do with an arborist to preserve it. So you can do cabling to help hold the tree together. You can do bracing to help hold it together. And honestly, in this case, I would recommend either doing that or, really thinking about possibly having it removed because you have the chance of this happening. So once included bark goes, it usually goes pretty quick, and it doesn't always tell you it's going to go ahead of time because it could be a little gust of wind that hits it just the right way that'll finally take it out. And this is why included bark can be dangerous, because obviously if this was a bigger tree and it was over a home, that would be a significant problem. So something else to look for is trunk lean. Trees are actually able to self-correct from trunk leans in a number of cases. So if you have a storm and all of a sudden your tree is leaning, definitely get that inspected for safety. If you have a tree like this that looks like it's been leaning for a while, take a look at it and see if it's showing signs of self-correction. So in this particular plant, we have these limbs coming over here that are quite large that are indicating to me that the tree's starting to work on self-correcting. I can also see down here that it looks like we have some extra wood growth, which is basically the tree's way of kind of holding itself up. So this particular plant is working on self-correcting and doesn't pose any immediate threat to anything. But again, a leaning tree is something to definitely look into. Generally, if a pine is leaning, that's just bad. You don't want to deal with a leaning pine. Palms are kind of the same way, depending on the species. Most palms don't lean. They're an upright species. And once you get a lean, you start to get stability issues. Trunk damage can come in a lot of different ways. In this particular plant, note that it does have this wonderful green area, and we've got sidewalks underneath for people to walk under. So this isn't a particularly good place for a tree that's literally littered with holes and cavities. This is great for animal habitat. In fact, this particular tree had a large amount of raccoons living in it. Wonderful in a forested area, where the tree's off a trail, where if the tree falls down, it's not going to hurt anybody. Not great for an urban or landscape setting. So this is one, it's a pecan tree. It did eventually get removed, but it's something to, again, think about. If you have a tree that's got a lot of cavities, you really want to get it inspected and see if it's safe to keep around. And this one also has dead limbs. It was barely alive. It was honestly held onto for a little too long. Something else to look for as far as trunk damage is looking for fungal bodies, also known as conchs, coming off of the trunk. Not all of them are a death sentence, but all of them are cause for at least concern to get them identified, find out what kind of rot they are causing or what they're ingesting. Some of them, they feed on sap and they're not a big deal. Some of them feed on rotting wood, in which case if they're there, that means they're feeding on rotting wood. Some of them feed on roots. This is a Ganoderma species. We'll talk about a different species of Ganoderma when we are talking about palms. But this one, may or may not be a problem on an oak. It really doesn't cause a huge issue. You'll generally see them more frequently on dead trees than you would live trees. All right, so we're going to move into making the cut. So I'll take a quick second to see if there's any questions related to the last section for clarification before we move forward.
It doesn't look like it.
Wonderful. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about making the cut. So I'm going to talk about reduction cuts first. So we're talking about 3 different cuts today: reduction cuts, heading cuts, and removal cuts. So reduction cuts are when you're reducing the size of a limb. You can reduce the size of a whole tree, but you usually think about it one limb at a time. So in this diagram, we have these limbs that have the dotted line circled there. So we're going to be looking at those as the reduction. So in this particular diagram, this part here is equivalent to this part here, or this part here, depending on which one you want to focus on. And the part A up here is the dotted line section. So what you're going to want to do is actually trim this back to what's the branch called the branch bark ridge. And the branch bark ridge is basically showing the top of the branch bark collar. So this is the branch. Here's that branch bark collar right here. And then you have that branch bark ridge. So the reason you go to the ridge instead of the collar is you're reducing the main stem. You're not pruning off the limb, if that makes sense. So you'll do several cuts. You're not going to just cut at that branch bark ridge. You want to do some cuts that reduce the weight. So maybe you're taking some of the weight off here. Maybe you're taking some of the weight off here, even down here before you take that final cut. Because if the limb weighs too much, you can have problems with saws getting stuck or the bark tearing, which is something we do not want bark to tear when we're doing pruning. That can be very bad. Again, it's that cambium tissue that can get damaged. And if it's damaged, it's not going to heal properly and can lead to branches further up that will die. Okay, so these are reduction cuts. Now, heading cuts are pretty much identical to reduction cuts, except the difference is instead of pruning back to the branch bark ridge, you prune back to a node. So in most cases, homeowners won't be doing too many heading cuts, potentially on smaller plants, but not necessarily on trees. You would be doing more of a reduction cut just because it's a lot easier to see. Now, these types of cuts are also cuts that you can do on any plant. You can do reduction cuts on, flowers. You can do heading cuts on flowers and on shrubs. It's just the way that you go about reducing weight on everything's a little different. All right, and this line is just, again, pointing out the branch bark collar. So next up is removal. So on this slide, I have some text. I am going to talk you through it. You can ignore it. It's there so that, if we're sending out this presentation for reference, I want you to have that available as a reference. So let's listen to me. Don't read right now. So we're going to talk. Your first cut when you're doing this, you have a 3-cut method when you're taking a limb off. So you're doing a removal cut. You're taking a limb off back to the trunk, okay? First off, you do that undercut. The undercut is one of the most important cuts you are going to make. So with the undercut, you're going about 12 inches from the trunk, and you're taking your saw and you're cutting underneath the branch. Now, the point of cutting underneath this branch is so that when you do your weight reduction cuts, those second cuts, if the bark rips, that undercut prevents it from going straight down the trunk of your tree. Very important that you don't forget your first undercut. Now, your second top cut, you might actually have more than one of these. This is reducing the weight so that you can have a manageable section that you're taking off at the end that's not going to cause damage to the tree. So if the limb's really long, you might have 2 or 3 second cuts before you're done. You're just making it so that last section is manageable and so that, whatever weight you're reducing isn't unmanageable either. So it says second cut, you can have multiple cuts above that undercut. And then your final cut is going to be at that branch bark collar, and you want to leave that branch bark collar intact. So it's all well and good on a diagram, but let's look at what this looks like on a real tree. So I have some more images for you. First off, this is showing that branch bark collar. This particular tree is nice because it has a little swollen area that shows you the difference between the branch bark collar and the branch, which is really nice. So we can see, yes, that's where a final cut would be. Versus no, which is where you would have what's called flush cut. And a flush cut cuts into the branch bark collar, damages the healing tissue, and makes it it takes a lot longer for the plant to actually heal. All right, so the next few slides I actually got from the IFAS website, and I wanted to kind of use this to show you what was going on. So this is one I talked about the branch. We've got the branch bark collar, and then we have the ridge. So right here is that branch bark ridge that I was mentioning. And you can see it's a ridge. It comes up, it's bark, it's attached to the branch. Now, how you know this isn't included bark is we have a U, not a V. That's how you can tell the difference, because sometimes the ridge can get a little confusing with included bark. So here we have where we're going to have our first cut, our second cut, and our third cut. So you'll take your saw. If you've got a wonderful saw like this, I have one just like this. I love it. It can take a finger off. So please be careful and wear protective equipment when you're doing this. So take your saw about 12 inches from the trunk. You're going to cut in about a third of the way into the branch. Then you're going to do your second cut to reduce weight. You can see it reducing weight here. And I want to draw your attention to this crack happening as he's reducing the weight. That crack indicates that a rip is about to occur. So in this particular instance, we can see it ripped all the way back to that undercut. And this is the point of that undercut. Had that undercut not been here, this could have gone all the way down, ripped into the trunk. And then once you have that happen, ultimately branches above that injury would start to die back over time because the vascular tissue isn't working. So then once you have this done, you're going to make that final cut at that branch bark collar. It should look like this when you're done. One way to know that you've done it correctly is, generally speaking, if it looks like a circle, it's at least close to the right location as long as it's back near the trunk. If it looks more like an oval, you've most likely cut into the branch bark collar. Now, as you learn, you're not going to always make perfect cuts. It's okay. It's just trying to do the best that you can. Here's on a larger tree, a generally good cut. I can tell they had a little bit of an issue at the end right here. Just trying to get it off. Not uncommon. So if you get that, don't feel bad about it. All right, that brings us to pruning problems. So a bunch of don't do it examples, and then also how we can correct things. So before I move into here, I just want to see if there were any questions on how to make pruning cuts.
It doesn't look like it.
Wonderful. You guys are doing a great job keeping up. So I'm going to go through a couple of no's with examples, and I'm going to explain why. And then we're also going to look at some trees that didn't have the best pruning job and can we fix them. So first off, I mentioned flush cuts. Flush cuts are a big no. I also mentioned not taking more than a third of a canopy off. That's also a no. So this particular branch was more than a third the size of the trunk of the tree. Also, I had seen it before it got pruned. This was in a neighborhood I used to live in. The branch was perfectly healthy. I don't know why they chose to take it off. But this is a flush cut for a branch this size. So for them to have done this correctly, they would have needed to be out just a bit more like that to get it. But because it's straight up and down, you're looking a little bit more at a flush cut. So let's look at flush cuts that have started to heal. So a flush cut, again, makes it slower for healing to occur and then increases the chances of fungal pathogens getting into the tree. Trees are fascinating with a whole bunch of different ways that they have to kind of block things from getting in. And if you don't take care of them correctly, it again makes things harder on the tree. So here we have a flush cut. One of the ways I know it's a flush cut is the healing tissue coming around is uneven. So it's really long over here. It's really short over here. So generally, if you've got the correct cut, the healing tissue is going to be even all the way around. I can see fungus starting here. I can see that the center is actually pretty dry and is already starting to rot out. That even happens occasionally on good pruning cuts, but this is because it's going to take longer. It increases the chances of pests and diseases breaking through the trunk, the branch tissue, and then into the trunk and causing problems. So here's a healed flush cut. So they can heal. It does take longer. Now, one of the ways you can tell it's a flush cut is it kind of has more of a cat eye slit right here. See if I can draw there. Whereas it looks a little bit more like a donut when you have a healed cut that has been pruned correctly. So if you go up to a tree and these are also completely flat against the trunk, you know it was a flush cut. And some people just don't realize that flush cuts are bad. They think, oh, I'm just going to level this off with the tree and make it a nice clean line, which some people think that that's a nice aesthetic, but it's not good for the health of the tree. You want to make sure that you prune at that angle with the branch bark collar. Now, sometimes injuries happen to a tree and you have no control over it. So we have this injury, we'll start at the top. To me, this looks like likely storm damage, but it looks like included bark was involved as well. I can see the start of an included bark issue in the future over here. So this wound's never going to heal completely. It's, pretty bad. And then we also have a limb that was most likely damaged when the top limb fell off. And here we can see, I'm going to erase that so we can see it a little bit more clearly. Here we can see, right, this is much bigger healing tissue than here. It's a flush cut. It's moving in to the tree. It's completely flat. So if this was a tree on your property and you had an arborist come out, I would fully expect them to advise taking this branch off completely. So topping is next. Topping is a no. It creates poor branch attachments. It actually creates a lot of water sprout growth. It has just, it's not good for your trees. It also increases your need for maintenance. So you don't want to top. And topping is indiscriminately trimming a tree to remove all of the vegetative growth, so all of the leaves. So there are proper ways to remove, you know, a large amount of leaves. That's not topping. And it's all about where you're making those cuts. So let's talk for a minute about crepe myrtles. Some of you may have heard the indiscriminate pruning of crepe myrtles is called crepe murder. It doesn't really kill the tree, but it definitely stresses it out and it delays flowering by up to a month, they have found in research. So topping is an example on the left. So topping, you can kind of see distinct cuts over the last 3 years. Whereas pollarding is an approved, legitimate pruning method where you cut to the exact same location every year. And by cutting to that exact same location every year, it allows the plants to accumulate some extra growing tissue in those what we call knuckles, and then they're able to heal faster. They're also able to sprout faster. And again, just prune back to that same spot every year if you have to. Now, why do I say if you have to? So crepe myrtles have varieties that come in maximum sizes anywhere from 5 to 30 feet. So ideally, you would pick the right plant for the right place. So ideally not putting a max size 30-foot crepe myrtle next to a house, but I know most of the time you move into a house, landscaping's already there, you didn't have a say, and you have no idea what that max size of that crepe myrtle is. So if you're in that situation and you don't want to remove the tree and replace it with something else, pollarding is really the best option for you to, again, keep that in the size that works for the location it's in. So here's an example of a crepe myrtle that's quite, getting up there in age. It's been pollarded all of its life. They get this kind of interesting structure. Now, this one hasn't just been pollarded at the ends. All of the branches are pollarded to the same location every year. So again, just making sure that your landscapers know what they're doing and can do the pollarding, not just the topping. And in case any of you have never seen a crepe myrtle that has not been pruned significantly, here's one in our Discovery Gardens here in Lake County. It's just starting to sprout out. I took this picture yesterday, so I promise it normally looks a lot more lush than this one, but they do get very large and they're, I find them quite pretty. So the next one is lion's tailing. This is a massive no. Some people call this hurricane pruning. And this is actually the opposite of what you want to do to prep a tree for a hurricane. So it increases the chance of limbs breaking through a storm. So I'll do a little bit of physics for you right now. So when wind hits a tree, the tree moves, right? Everybody's seen trees sway in the wind. That's normal. Trees are meant to sway because if they didn't sway, they would break. Now, on a nice healthy tree that has lots of internal limbs, when the wind hits the outside of the branches, the wind kind of shakes down and that force the force becomes weakened as it hits different branch attachments. It's able to disperse more through the tree, eventually go down to the trunk, disperse through the roots into the soil. That's the way the tree's designed. If you lion tail, what you do is you basically take out the majority of any internal structure whatsoever. And some people say, well, it lets the wind go through, so it's not going to be as much of a problem. Well, the problem is all of the weight is at the end, like a lion's tail. And then there's really nothing between that end and the next branch attachment, which puts a lot of force on that attachment whenever something's moving in the wind. And ultimately, it's just not a strong enough attachment to deal with that much force, and they tend to break. And they'll tend to break at all kind of different points, depending on where the wind's coming from. So what you would do instead is to selectively take out some, not all, but some internal structure, maybe do some reduction cuts, not full removal cuts in the inside. So you have some pockets where wind can go through, but not where the wind can just kind of blast through and then start breaking branches. So now we're going to get into some trees that just haven't had the best pruning job, and can we fix it? So this particular tree, it's an elm, and it's kind of a combination between topping and lion tailing. I honestly don't know what whoever pruned this was thinking. It doesn't look like they necessarily knew what they were doing, to be quite honest. So we're going to go in a little bit. I can see at least one heading cut. So we've got a heading cut right there that was pruned back to a node, but then this was not pruned back to a node. That's a top. So we've got lots of different things happening here. At this point for this tree, what I would do is some significant reduction pruning to try to get some sort of shape and form back to it. Short of that, I would even consider just replacing it with something that's going to fit that spot better, that's going to have better pruning over time. But you can still do reduction cuts and see if it comes back to a point that, you know, is usable and you can keep it in that location. Here's a tree that I looked at recently. The people are trying to get everything fixed up on it, and they were really receptive to all of my suggestions. So here we have several different things that are happening. So if you have something, oops, where are my images? Oh, it's in the next one, sorry. Zoomed in. I was looking for my circles. Here's my circles. So if you have something that's kind of cut indiscriminately inside the canopy, we refer to that as either a stub or a snag. And that's because over time, those are going to rot out. That's going to turn into those dead branches we talked about earlier. And these are actually easily fixed. So we have several of them, and this isn't even all of them in the image, but all of these can be corrected simply by going back in and making those cuts at that branch bark collar. Grab this guy up here. We can go back here a little bit. It's very hard to draw at the exact right point on these. This one's going to be around there somewhere. This one's close. It just needs this one right here. That one's close. Sorry for the scribble. I can't, a little difficult to draw on it. So the two on the end with the smaller circles are close to correct. It's just some minor corrections to get those right. So just because your tree has bad pruning doesn't mean you can't do corrective pruning on it. Now here we have something else. Here we have a branch that's starting to compete with the central leader. So this branch is kind of going off on its own, deciding what it wants to do. It does have a U branch attachment, which means it's a decent branch attachment, but because we're starting to get this extra long growth, it's not really something structurally you want to keep. Remember where I said sometimes you can get kind of leggy branches that just don't look right and you need to take them out? This is an example of that. So here we have, again, we have that bark ridge right here. And since this isn't a full branch coming out of a trunk, it's kind of an extra growth of the trunk. You're not going to have a branch bark collar exactly. So when you have those cases, you still want to go ahead and cut underneath that branch bark ridge at an angle, attempting to mimic what you would do if there was an actual collar there. So in this case, you'd do some reduction cuts to take that weight off. You would still do an undercut somewhere around this vicinity, and then your final cut would be at that larger line there. Now, throughout this presentation, I have mentioned that the stem coming in or the branch is very separate from the trunk tissue, and this is a great example of that. So here we can see that that extra stub or snag that is still there is completely rotting out. It looks like you can just take it and pull it out. And if I could reach it, I honestly would have tried to see if it would work. We have a perfectly intact branch bark collar that is attempting to heal it, but because this, rotten piece of wood's in the way, it can't actually close over that wound. So this is one that you could just take a saw, cut this off. You can see where the branch bark collar is, and then it will grow over much more quickly. And there is that branch bark collar. So here we have some more branches that just don't have the correct pruning that are super easy to fix, right? We've got a cut there. And then we have one that's actually correct. So it's always nice when we see one that is correct. All right, I know that was a lot. I just want to pause before we get into the palms to see if there is any questions I need to address now. The next two sections are significantly shorter.
Yes, we have, should you paint on a healing liquid to a freshly removed branch area?
That is a wonderful question. The answer is no. You don't want to paint it. So when trees are cut, they're naturally going to push out sap that helps to push out anything that's trying to get in. So if you've got bacteria, if you've got fungus, if you've got insects or anything, that sap helps to push it out. Just like if you get injured, you bleed, you want it to bleed a little bit to help push anything out before you start taking care of it. In trees, that sap's going to dry and help to protect it. So you don't want to actually paint it at all. In fact, a lot of cases, if you paint it, you've actually now blocked in bacteria and fungus particles because they're all around. And the second you cut, they get attached to your cut. And then when you paint it dark, you've got a nice dark, moist environment, and you can potentially increase the chance of something happening internally. And you won't be able to see it because it's painted over. So definitely don't bother with the painting. It's not necessary.
Okay. And one more question about pruning citrus and figs. When and how?
So pruning fruit trees is different than pruning landscape trees. So I don't want to get into it too much right now because it goes against most of what I'm telling you when you're pruning fruit. Because when you prune fruit trees, you want to stress them out to increase flower production, to increase fruit production. So a lot of the ways you prune fruit trees is it not the same way you would prune landscape trees. So maybe we'll hold off on the answers to those questions for a specific presentation about fruit tree pruning. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right. So I mentioned that palms are not trees. They don't produce wood. They don't have branch structures. And in general, honestly, they're a lot easier to manage than trees are because you're pretty much just pruning off leaves as needed. So here is a diagram of the parts of the palm, and you can already see it's significantly different than the diagram for the parts of a tree. You still have a crown that includes all of the leaves. Sometimes people call them fronds. They're leaves. It's okay to call them leaves. New leaves are called leaf spheres. Underneath, you can have a crown shaft. You have inflorescence with flowers and fruits, and you also get old leaves. Now, going up and down the trunk, you'll have leaf scars where old leaves have been attached as this moves up. And you have this, what's called an advantageous root system. So if you've ever seen palms get planted on a highway, they have a much smaller root ball than if you see large woody trees get planted, because woody trees need a much larger root structure to get established because their roots don't grow as quickly as palms do, and they just grow in a different way. Palms are actually more closely related to grasses than woody trees. Now, something to consider when you are talking about palms, in general, prune at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. You don't need to prune any higher than that. And wait until the fronds are brown. So palms have this amazing ability. As the lower fronds die, they reabsorb the nutrients of that. So it reduces the need to fertilize if you're reabsorbing those nutrients. If you're cutting off green leaves, you're cutting off money basically, because you're cutting off nutrients that you're going to have to pay to put back on that plant later on. Will you still need to fertilize? Most likely. Palms have certain nutrients that they'll get deficient in, but you're reducing the amount you have to fertilize if you just wait until those fronds are fully brown. Now that's only for if the fronds are brown on the bottom. That's natural leaf senescence. They will drop. If the entire canopy is starting to look weird or you're getting brown at the top, talk to your local extension agent. Something else might be going on with your palm. So here's an example of bad pruning on a palm. Sometimes this is called pineapple pruning. This is unnecessary. Some people will say it's hurricane pruning. It's not. Again, there's no such thing as hurricane pruning in anything. So palms evolved where hurricanes happen. So they are adapted to hurricanes. In fact, they need the leaves to protect the growing tissue at the top so that when it's windy and things are happening, the growing tissue is protected by those leaves. The leaves might get shredded, they might get damaged, but that's okay because their goal is to protect the growing tissue so the plant can keep living. If you do something like this, and then you have a big storm come through and those fronds get broken, it's likely they're also breaking that top meristem. It's called the apical meristem, which is the growing tissue of a palm. Remember, cambium tissue on the outside was the important part of a tree. That meristem, that apical meristem, is the most important part on a palm. So you want to make sure that stays protected. So here we have not quite as bad, but still bad pruning. So again, 9 and 3 is really where you want to go. I mentioned leaning palms. So hopefully you guys can tell what's happening here. This is a case of It's not necessarily the wrong plant in the wrong place. It's just the large tree next to it hasn't been maintained properly for it. So that could have been reduced over time, and then that other palm wouldn't have that fun lean to it. If the tree is pruned back, the palm should be able to correct itself enough that it's not going to cause any stability issues there. Now, I did mention Ganoderma on a palm. So Ganoderma butt rot is one of the really quite bad diseases that we have locally for our palms. This is what it can look like. It's this one's quite old, which is why it's white. Generally speaking, if you see a fungal body on the base of your trunk, take an image, get with your local extension agent immediately. It's most likely Ganoderma butt rot. Your plant needs to be taken out as soon as possible, the entire plant, roots and all. And odds are you're not going to be able to plant another palm in that area unless you want to do a relatively massive amount of soil restoration, where you just take out the soil because it's full of the fungal tissue and spores, and then putting new soil down. So it's just something I definitely want you all to be aware of. So I told you it was short. That's the end of the palm presentation. So I'm going to talk a bit about homeowner safety and pruning next, but is there any palm question specific right now?
Excuse me. Let me see here. Do palm roots extend out to the frond drip line?
Palm roots are fun. They can do all kind of weird things. They will extend out. I don't study palms enough to have learned exactly how far out they go. They would go out at least to the drip line and farther than that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be stable. But I don't know if they go out as far as the tree is tall. So like trees, like true woody trees, if you were to like take the tree and lean it over, the roots go out a minimum that far and usually farther than that. I'm not sure if that's the same in palms, but I can definitely look that up and get back to you all on it. But they do go out far enough for stability for sure.
Okay, is trimming a coconut tree the same as trimming a palm?
Yep, coconut is a palm. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this one just says trading moss on the trunks of palms.
Not necessary. It doesn't harm them at all. So you might get lichens on trees or palms. Lichens are a passive organism. They're just hanging on because it's still. If you had rocks on your property, lichen can grow on it. It doesn't harm anything. In fact, it can be a sign of good air quality. So no concern, you can leave it. Something like Spanish moss or ball moss, again, no concern. If you don't like it, you can just pull it off. No need to treat it with anything specific. In fact, the things that you would generally treat it with could harm other things in your property. So just manual removal is generally best.
Okay. When can you prune off the fruit of the palm to avoid them falling and making a mess in the landscape?
Honestly, you can prune the fruit whenever you feel like if you don't want it. I would suggest leaving the flowers on as long as possible because they are an important food source for pollinators. And the fruit's important for some wildlife as well. But if you live in a planned community, you probably don't want that wildlife coming into your yard. So you can go ahead and take it out once it starts transitioning from fruit to flower. And that's really up to you.
Okay. I've got a couple more, but I'll leave it till the end.
Okay. We're almost done. So this is designed to be overwhelming. It's okay to feel overwhelming. So this is homeowner safety and PPE. So things to remember, don't use chainsaws unless you're trained. Work from the ground. Don't use ropes and ladders or climbing equipment unless you're trained. Never use a chainsaw above your shoulder. Closed-toed shoes, chaps, glove, hearing protection, hard hats, all of these things. Don't prune your power lines. And at this point, if you're feeling overwhelmed, call the professionals because they're going to be able to get in there and do things safely and then keeps you safe and keeps your plant healthy. So why call? Now, we always recommend calling an ISA Certified Arborist. And the reason for that is that certified arborists are trained in tree biology and safety. They've also signed a code of ethics. So if something happens, you actually can go to ISA and make an official complaint. They can also plan long-term. They're going to think long-term about your plant. And you can potentially have that person for years and they will have a plan written out for your plant, know what years to come and what to do moving forward. So if you're calling somebody, you want to check to see if they're certified arborists, you can get their number and you'll be able to look them up to make sure that they're current. Always ask for insurance. It's good to ask them about the ANSI Z133.1 and A300 standard. You don't have to fully understand those, but they need to be able to answer you, and they should talk to you about safety and proper pruning. Always get a written quote for the work. An arborist will give you a written quote that literally outlines everything they're going to do. We're going to prune X amount of large branches. The cost for each branch is this. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. It gets really detailed. And if someone mentions, yeah, I'll just top that tree for you, really think about not hiring them, because that's not going to be what's best for your plant. Now, they can, again, do reduction, they can do polarding, but you don't want them to do topping. And if they say they're going to climb your tree with crampons on and the tree's alive, that's another thing that's a little bit questionable. If you're looking for an arborist, look at treesaregood.org. There's a way that you can search for an arborist based on your zip code. And, always call multiple people. The person on top is just geographically closest to you. It doesn't mean they're the best. And you might have several people on that list that are consultants, not tree workers. And you might want a consultant to come out and give you an unbiased opinion, because they're not also doing the work. So they won't, if you are afraid somebody's going to tell you need more work than you really need, you can get a consultant to come out before you actually have the tree crew come. All right, we're moving on to shrubs. Again, relatively short with shrubs, because pruning shrubs is really dependent on what you have. So exactly how you prune shrubs depends on the species. It depends on the look you're going for. So generally, large woody shrubs, you can prune them the same way you prune trees, as far as doing reduction cuts, heading cuts, and removal cuts. Some woody shrubs you can hedge, some you really can't. It doesn't work as well. And it's the same kind of with any shrubs. Some shrubs hedge, some shrubs don't. So here is a podocarp. We have these actually as a hedge in our Discovery Garden here in Lake County, and we even have a children's maze made out of them. They can work really well as a hedge. You do have to kind of keep up with them. Otherwise, when you prune, you might end up with empty spots because, you've let them grow a little bit too much. There's different kinds of hollies that work really well for hedging. Now, generally speaking, when you're doing hedging, and just trimming shrubs in general, you want to make sure the bottom is actually farther out than the top so that the light can get to it. So ironically, these are in our parking lot and they're not quite trimmed correctly on this side of some of them, but nobody's perfect and we're just kind of letting those grow out. It's a contracted crew that comes out to do that. Things happen, it's fine. And then we have these little ones in our rose garden that my master gardeners maintain. Some more little hollies trimmed around. Now, if you have something more like an azalea or another flowering shrub, you want to trim them after they have flowered. I have seen azaleas pruned into a hedge. My preference for pruning azaleas is to individually kind of cut them back and take it a little bit more, specialized. But it's really up to whatever you're wanting to do in your landscape. Now, another option as a hedge would be something like a ligustrum. And again, you can hedge ligustrum. There's large leaf and there's also small leaf ligustrums that you can use as well. Simpson stopper is a good native that you can also hedge or prune into like a large shrub or almost like a small tree. And with that, that brings me to the end of the presentation today. So I am ready for all of the questions. And thank you guys for coming.
Great. Let's see here. Is it beneficial to manually remove Spanish moss from oak trees, or is it just an exercise in futility? I know that's not a pruning question.
Well, I mean, it is a bit of an exercise in futility. So Spanish moss doesn't harm trees. Now, if you have a tree that you notice it's not leafing out or it's reducing the amount of leaves and the amount of moss is increasing, that indicates that the tree has a problem. Moss is not the problem. Moss is just helping to indicate that you have a problem. Now, if branches are really weak and dying, there is the slight potential that the added moss with weight and wind could help with the breakage of that limb, but the limb was already going to break. So again, the moss isn't causing the problem. It indicates that there is an issue if you get way too much of it. But basically, if it gets to be too much, manually remove it, but it's going to come back.
Okay, What about cutting roots to avoid sidewalk damage?
I would not recommend cutting roots if you can avoid it. Roots are there for stability, and it would be a one-on-one question. There are ways that you can arch sidewalks over roots to prevent them from being an issue. And there are some new publications out by UF indicating how far you should plant a tree from infrastructure to reduce the risk of issues with not only sidewalks and driveways, but also utilities.
Okay. Do you trim a Royal Poinciana, and how?
You would trim a Royal Poinciana just the way you would trim any other tree. You would pick out, what the shape is that you're looking for. And in Florida, you can pretty much prune whenever you want. Generally, I like to prune when trees are actually, kind of at the point where they're just before they're starting to get ready to leaf out, or in the fall.
Okay. This one says, I have an autograph tree damaged by frost in January, about 4 feet tall, pretty much all dead. Do I prune now or wait to see if it's dead or will come back? If so, how much to take off?
So it's hard for me to tell how much to take off because I don't know how big this tree is, but generally take your fingernail, scratch the bark a little bit. You can scratch it on a twig. If it's still green, that means it's still alive. So if you have parts that have turned black and are completely dead, you can go ahead and prune those back to either a lateral branch or a node. But I would definitely suggest sending some of those pictures to your local extension agent to see if they can give you some more specific recommendations. Because again, not seeing it, it's really hard for me to give you specifics.
Okay. I have a podocarpus tree and was told it would get as tall as a pine, that I should head it back to get it to spread. Is that okay?
I wouldn't recommend doing that to a podocarp. Podocarps are amazing plants and they can get tall. So podocarp is kind of a generic term. So we have a podocarp hedge, but that podocarp isn't the same species as a tree. So if you want a podocarp hedge, I would suggest getting the hedge because the trees can get very large, but they're also amazingly cool. And to me, topping a podocarp tree would be like topping a pine tree. First off, it would kill a pine tree, and it's just not going to be super beneficial to the health of a podocarp tree.
Okay. Should I give the tree or shrub needing pruning a good watering prior to pruning?
Not necessarily. It depends on kind of how big the tree is. If the tree is about the width of an average human, you don't have to water it at all. It's getting water from somewhere. But I'd really water after I prune, not before.
Okay. This is not a shrub, but when should I cut back decorative grasses?
Decorative grasses, you cut back kind of once a year, and it depends on which decorative grasses. Some you cut back in the fall and some you cut back in the spring.
Okay. Should you prune healthy lower leaves from a Robolini or pygmy date palm?
Nope. If it's healthy, don't prune them off.
Sure.
Leave them there.
This question is for me. Did you indicate that we would be receiving the presentation material? This has been recorded and will be available on floridafriendlylandscaping.com under resources and then under webinars. It will take me a couple weeks to get it up, but it will be up there along with all of the other presentations that we've had for the past 2 years. Let me see here.
Go ahead and stop my share.
Sure. Let me see where my question went. Where did it go? Have you seen a live oak cabled in Florida? I was told by an arborist that they don't cable trees here, too much liability.
I have definitely seen live oaks cabled in Florida. I could almost tell you exactly where one is in Lakeland because I would walk by it all the time when I used to live there.
Okay. Any advice about trimming roots around a septic drain field?
When you get into trimming roots, it's complicated and it's individual, so I don't want to give blanket advice. on it.
Mhm.
I would definitely say have a professional come out and look into it to see if what's going on, because I don't want you to cut roots that take away the structural integrity of the plant.
Okay. When buying trees, should I buy a tree with a single dominant leader or multiple low branching?
Depends on what species you're going after. If
Okay.
you're going after a large canopy tree, generally single leader is best. If you're going after something that is more of an understory plant, some of them are just naturally multi-stemmed.
Okay. And I think, let's see. Do you also give a presentation on fruit tree trimming?
I have not done that yet, but it's on my list
Okay.
of things that I need to work on.
Okay, well, maybe we'll have you back when you get that done. It looks like a lot of people want a presentation on fruit tree trimming. Could I please repeat where the presentations are saved? It's floridafriendlylandscaping.com under resources and then under webinars. Let's see here. Is there a general rule when establishing tree rings? How far should I go? I'm not quite sure what that means.
I don't understand that either.
Okay. Let me check here. Somebody asked, what is cabling?
So cabling is just what it sounds like. It's if you have a tree that is like that one live oak I was showing you. So a cable would be you drill through one branch and then you drill through another branch. You have a cable that you go through and tie on either side. And what that does is it helps distribute the weight more evenly and it helps to hold things together.
Okay. How can you find out what the shrub should look like? Single trunk, multiple, hedge, don't hedge, etc.
There's a lot of information on the University of Florida's website. You can also ask your local extension office if you need help finding that information, that go into species specific information that will tell you, you know, kind of what to expect from different plants.
Okay, and I think this was a palm question. What did you mean by pruning 9 to 3?
So what I mean by 9 to 3 is like if you look at a clock, right? 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. That's what I mean. So you're just pruning no higher than that if you're pruning the leaves. So if you're looking at that clock, the top half should be that top half of the clock, 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock.
Okay. Looks like that is all the questions. So I want to thank you very much for coming on today. And it was a great presentation. There are a lot of thank yous in the comments. If you do end up having a presentation for fruit trees, let me know and I'll get you back here. So
Right.
thank you
making
very
a note
much.
for that. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks. We have a great day.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.